All right. I see the recording is on, so I'm going to go ahead and call this work session to order on AM 641-2020, non-encumbering contracts to 17 contractors for as-needed information technology services for the Municipality of Anchorage. Can we start with a roll call, please?
Yes, Mr. Chair. Ms. Allard. Ms. Allard? Mr. Constant?
Here.
Mr. Dunbar? Ms. Kennedy?
Here.
Ms. LaFrance?
Here.
Mr. Presberdia?
Here.
Mr. Peterson?
Present.
Mr. Rivera?
Present.
Mr. Weddleton? And Ms. Zalatel.
All right, thank you. So as usual for the queue, if members want to get in the queue, please put yourself in the chat or text me if you can't access the chat. All right, so let's go ahead and start with the administration. If you all have a presentation, please go ahead.
This is Susie. I just shared my screen. Can you guys see it?
Yes, we can see it. Okay,
great. So thanks for joining this session on behalf of the AM 641 2020. I'm Susie Marshall, Chief Information Technology Officer, and I am joined, I've got two staff that are joining me. I've got Gail Turner, and she is my business manager, and then I have Mark Merchant, who is my Chief Information Security Officer. So just letting you know they're on the call as well. And feel free to interrupt. I'm just kind of go through anyway, I'll just keep going, but if you need to stop me and ask a question, feel free. Okay, so first question, what are these non-encumbering contracts for as-needed information technology services? So we call these our AnITA contracts, using that acronym, as-needed information technology. And so what they are is they provide us, our team, the ability to hire temporary information technology consultants and resources when our core OIT resources are not available. And examples of current AnITA workers that where we've used these contractors, we've used them. We have a project manager for the property appraisal software replacement project. That's the CAMA project. I think you guys are pretty familiar with that, but that is a large effort, and therefore we needed a dedicated project manager for that work. And therefore we use the AnITA contract to fulfill that request. Another example is we hired another project manager for our MLMP. So during the MLMP sale, our team, the OIT team, we had to do this big infrastructure separation activity because, anyway, that's not the goal of this conversation, but we had to do this large body of work to make sure that we could give Chugach, the MLMP company, as a separate network unit. And so we had to hire a project manager, and we actually hired we hired some technical resources using the AnITA contract to help us with that effort because it was a short-term effort. Another example is we used it for website development. So development services, they wanted a new muni.org website built, and they had a very specific timeline and grant funds they needed used, and therefore so we went to the AnITA contracts and found a resource and fulfilled that obligation. And then one more example of how we use these AnITA contracts is we were having difficulty hiring a person and a database administrator, so someone on staff, and we weren't getting any qualified candidates So we had to do some internal staff augmentation where we actually hired someone to do operational work short term while we kept interviewing and looking for people to fulfill. So those are examples of how we use the AnITA contracts. So another feature of the AnITA contracts is these are not...
Actually, before you continue, I just want to note for the record, we've been joined by Mr. Constant, Ms. Zolotel, and Mr. Wilton. Thanks.
Great. Okay. So another feature of the AnITA contracts is that these are non-encumbering contracts. So there are no funds allocated or encumbered with an AnITA contracts. So they're used as needed to support projects or initiatives that where the funding is already, and they use, and when they're used, that effort is already, it's funded using an approved funding source. So an approved funding source would be your operating budget, capital budget, or a grant. So I think there's been some questions on what is that. Is that clear? Does that make sense? I think it's very common practice throughout the municipality, and Ron could speak to that if you have any questions about non-encumbering contracts. Okay. Okay. Another thing about our AnITA contracts is for this current AnITA contract issuing is we have 34 skill schedules. So that's the scope. That is the actual scope we are getting these contractors to help us with. And this is just to give you an idea of the type of consultants and help that we get. And that's, I mean, I don't need to go through this list, but it's very technical. And hopefully it's just kind of clear. The other thing is the AnITA RFP process. This is the RFP process we implemented to award or to recommend an award for the AnITA RFPs for the AnITA contracts. So basically we go through the RFP is conducted using the MOA purchasing guidelines. The MOA purchasing officer works with our team and we come up with the RFP. They approve it, we get it posted, and there's a RFP review committee. This time around, we had 39 proposals, and then the committee recommended awarding 17 contracts. And then the next step in the process is to negotiate the contracts with the vendors, and that's with our department works with legal, and basically we identify all the skills that this one consultant can do. Remember, I gave you the skill list, not all the we have 17 contractors because we want to make sure we have at least one, possible. It's great to have 2 vendors that can do the skills so that we have all of our 34 skills covered. OIT vets the skills. The firm gives us their hourly rates, and then we negotiate the contract, and then we would create a skill schedule with the associated rates, and that's what we use to support our operations. So how do we use the AnITA contracts in our daily operation work? Basically, we identify the need for the temporary resource, and then we send an email to all of our AnITA contract holders, contract vendors. So all of these 17 contractors, we would send them an email. If we identify the need for this specific skill, and that vendor says they have staff that can do that skill, then we send the email to those vendors and we tell them, we identify what we're looking for. We give them a timeline. We tell them how fast we want them to respond to us. We identify whether the work is performed on site or can be done remote. And then we go through a very lengthy, here's all the very specific skills that we need for this specific request. So we send out that information, and then the vendors then have their timeline and they respond. with the details, and they'll send us resumes of all their proposed candidates. And so then they send us the information, we review it, and we compare it. We do interviews, and then we select the resource, and we secure the funding. And then we work with the vendor to create a scope of work, and then the PO would be issued, and that's the PO gets issued against approved funds, and that's how you officially authorize the work. Okay, so the history of AnITA contracts. So in 2017, it was the first time we did the AnITA contracts, and we had 13 AnITA contracts that were awarded after an RFP process. And those were 3 one-year terms. And the total non-encumbering contract value for those 13 was $20.5 million. And we only had 29 skill schedules. So when we went to issue, when it's time to do our next, to do new AnITA contracts. So we said, well, let's reevaluate this. I think we need a few more skills added because the work landscape has changed. You know, we have different technologies that we have to support, and we know some things that are coming up on the horizon. So so we went from 29 to 36, and then we also were thinking about of all the different projects that are coming up in the near term. How are we gonna? What are the things that are gonna do, and can we increase our contractor, the AnITA contract awards to make sure that we can fulfill this? And then we did a longer term. Instead of 3 years, we gave a horizon of out to 6 years max, so that we go through this, because an RFP process takes 6+ months. It's a long time to invest. And we wanted to make sure that we had enough use out of this big investment of time. So why do we think there's going to be more demand for AnITA resources? And here's kind of just a short preview of things that we know about, or just some things to bring to light that you guys, I think, are pretty aware of. Is that APD is purchasing a new computer-aided dispatch system, and they're also doing the body cameras, and they have a new phone recording system to support. So that is a really big implementation, and to support APD, that is a big project coming up soon. The transit department is also upgrading their technology that supports their department. They have old technology that hasn't been supported or upgraded for years. I mean, like, we're talking probably 10+. And so that's going to require some additional resources. Almost every department wants their department website upgraded. So there are some we can do in-house, but if we have 30 departments want them all at once, we're going to need some additional resources. Another thing coming up is that we know that our wireless access points, our wireless technology that we have deployed in all of our buildings is old, and it's really end of life. So we're going to have to upgrade that, but we're also going to have to learn what the new technologies are. And so we'll probably have to get some consultants to help us through that process and get our team trained up. Another thing is a comprehensive physical security system. So every department wants, not every department, but there is a larger demand for network-based, so IP-based security cameras that now connect to servers that do all the other stuff, that also do access controls. And we're just looking at that like, okay, we're going to need to support all this newer technology in that regard. So that's what we see coming up, and why we think the demand for our AnITA resources is going to increase. So once again, kind of like, these are non-encumbering master vendor contracts. Purchase orders like I said, it's the end of the process, and that's the mechanism that actually funds and approves the negotiated scope of work. Purchase orders are applied to the vendor contract, and that's how you apply that to their total value. So that's where you would say, if I've got a $3 million contract and I've used 100,000, that there would be that purchase order of 100,000 would apply. So that's how the dollar value, that's how the POs match up to the contract maximum spend. We've set these up for, we want our three-year contracts with 3 one-year term extensions. And we decided to make all contracts created equal. So instead of saying, well, we think the value of this one might be, we might use it less, and to go through all that, we decided we would be equal to all the contracts, because once again, this is non-encumbering. So there's a max spend on the contract, and it's once again only if the funds are approved, an approved funding source is already there, then it would be able to spend. And then if there's a need for an additional non-encumbering funds, those requests would have to run through this assembly process as well, if there's a need for more. So that's it for the presentation, and I don't know what kind of questions you guys have, or.
Great, thank you so much, Susie.
Yeah.
Are there any questions from members? Ms. Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, Susie. I appreciate all the information, because I was probably the one that had the most questions about this, and was the reason why we postponed this, so that we could have this conversation. I still have a huge list of questions. I will point out 2 things, and one is that it is my aide, my assembly aide, that did the vast, giant deep dive into this ordinance. So I have to thank Kim Collins for all the work that she put into kind of highlighting some of these questions. And then I want to thank you, Susie, and your team for the response to a lot of these. But again, there are several questions that I have. First, I kind of want to make the comment that I still think this is a really broad and kind of nebulous use of potential funds, and I would much rather see those contracts tightened down. You said that you used that kind of to try to treat them all equally, and I guess I just want to say that I don't necessarily want to send the message out to the IT world that we have all this money to throw at various contracts. I'd rather think that they would have to be just as cautious as we should be about how we spend our money. But specifically, 2 questions. One is in regard to, let's see here, I'm trying to get to, at what point, you mentioned a little bit about how hard it is sometimes to have the right personnel to deal with this specificity needed for certain IT requirements. And it certainly appears to me that we could spend a lot less money actually hiring people that we could even get trained and certified and have on board for a variety of those kinds of needs. So have we looked into anything like that? And I guess, at what point, where's the pivot point or the threshold by which we could be making that decision? That seems to me we could hire somebody for $250,000, which would be cheaper than having multiple $million-dollar contracts. So can you just comment on that briefly? And then I've got a couple other questions. And of course, you can cut me off, Mr. Chair, if you need to. Thanks.
Sure. So through the chair, the question on can we get staff, a lot of these needs are very short term. So you only need somebody for 6 months and then the need is gone. So to have to put the effort to look for an employee to meet the need, to hire them, you're hiring them, that's a forever commitment. Like you're you're increasing your staff. And if you really only need somebody for, like, say, up to 6 months, it's just not a realistic way to staff and run an IT operation. It's really common practice to have experts that are on contract that, I mean, this is in other industries as well, to have this kind of model to have to fill a temporary need with an expert. And I'm just gonna add, can I pivot this to Ron? Can you kind of talk about how you have other contracts similar to this throughout the municipality?
Yes, yes, Susie, through the chair, we have a number of these type of contracts. For instance, in project management engineering, they have a number of architects and engineering firms on this particular type of contract where you have a specific need for a short-term requirement, you contract it out. It's not unusual in any of the industries to use this type of approach. And I think it's important to understand that these are not to exceed values. There's no guarantee that we're going to spend any money on any of these contractors. It's all going to depend on what the need is. And then Susie and their crew also negotiate very strongly with these contractors to make sure that they get a reasonable price for that specific short-term need that they have.
Does that answer
Thank
your
you, but yeah, sort of. I guess what I'm really trying to get at is, at what point would we decide that it's worth it to hire somebody that may be trained in 2 or 3 different expertise areas and use them for multiple ways, for a longer period of time. So anyway, maybe that's something that's not possible given the level of expertise required. So anyway, just a thought, and you can comment on that if you want to, Susie, but I guess I was just kind of a little bit of brainstorming in that area. Thanks.
Yeah, I appreciate your observation, and I do think that what I want you to understand is that we are constantly doing that. We are constantly like, okay, is our business model change? What do we need to support next? It is really because IT is a super fast changing environment. So it is a constant conversation from us on this side. So, and we are always looking at, should we just train these people to do the X, Y, Z? But a lot of times these are very, all of a sudden they need somebody in 2 weeks, So I super appreciate your question, and it's well observed. That answers that.
Thank you. And Mr. Chair, I have another question, but I see Ms. Zolotel has one on this topic. So if you could come back to me later, that'd be great. Thanks.
Thanks, can do. Before I get to you, Ms. Zolotel, Mr. Slivka.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was just going to follow up on what Mr. Hayden said. The municipality, we spend across all of our enterprises over $800 million a year, and we try to do that efficiently and in compliance with code and for the least amount possible. And so, as Ron said, these types of contracts, we use them with PM&E, we use them with M&O. We use them so that we can be efficient, timely, and cost-effective in the work that we do, and that IT is a huge component of what gets done in this world. And, just because we're authorized through these proposal to be able to spend $51 million, it doesn't mean that all of a sudden we're going to go crazy and spend that money on this, that, and the other thing. We are going to continue to operate in a very efficient manner. I realize that the dollar amount gives one pause, but this all happens within the confines of the very disciplined budgeting process that we have gone through with the assembly. So I realize that you may look at it and say, wow, we're not being careful, but in fact, quite the opposite is true. We are acting with extreme diligence and caution in how we process this money. So thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Zolotel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wanted to just follow up a little bit on what Ms. Kennedy was getting at about the topic of a hire versus a contract. I know with particularly with regard to website upgrades or revamping websites. There seems to be a significant queue for those projects. I'm wondering, is there someone project managing all those requests? I know it can be really frustrating. I know it's been something the Assembly's been trying to work on and getting its work updated. And I'm wondering if that's something that we have someone, that almost feels like it would be a full-time job, just keeping up with all of the requests from all of the departments to keep their public interface moving and being up to date. Or is there any kind of strategic planning around that? I kind of just want to know where all those requests, how those fit within this overall scheme of how we approach getting the work done.
This is so, Ms. Zaltel, we always have a constant stream of requests for upgrades, operational support, and web is part of that process. And as we do it, a lot of the departments maintain the content, right? Actually, most departments maintain their own content right now because we've built tools to allow them to maintain the content. But when we're talking about a redesign, yes, we have a project management team that works with me, and we track all of people submit, yes, I'd like my website upgraded. We evaluate it. We figure out when we can do it, and we put it in a queue, and we work with the department as we get those. So we definitely have a work process to support all those upgrades, and a lot of them, it's funding, and it's also how do we because we can't do everything at once. This year was just a huge focus on how do we support a remote workforce. None of that was planned before March, right? We suddenly had to change our focus and, support meetings and Office 365 and Teams, and how could we now do this? And so a lot of the other things that we had planned had to kind of just go on the side while we did this. But if we had, so in this world, that would be if somebody said, well, my department has an extra $30,000 that we haven't spent in our operation budget yet. We could say, hey, we could find and need a resource to build you a website. If you need it done within 3 months, let's use our contract vehicle. You have an approved budget, and we'll find somebody to come in and solve this. We'll project management for you to get it done to meet the needs of the customer. But that's how that would work. Does that describe does that answer your question?
Kind of. Thanks. I'll think about it a little bit more.
Okay.
Thanks. Mr. Constant, is your question on this topic?
Nope, it's going to be down a different road.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and go back to Ms. Kennedy then. Go ahead, Ms. Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My second question is in regard to something that you brought up, Susie, in regard to the projects that we can kind of see coming down the pike here, and that is my question about that is, it seems to me that if we're ordering new software, new equipment, have new programming, whatever going on, that there's an element within that contract for those new services and equipment that would provide some level of customer service. So I guess I'm confused as to why that wouldn't be negotiated in with that original contract as we move into these big new programs, and why we would have to have something separate from the IT department that basically has to contract out for the expertise on those new programs. So can you explain kind of really what's happening there? Thanks.
Yes, through the chair. A good example would be this, the APD, their whole system upgrade. When they're pitching and securing funding for their project, oftentimes they'll say, I need a business analyst to help document our business process, and I need a project manager, and I need this, and they will include that in the scope and the pricing, but they don't have the staff to do it. And that is where we come in. And oftentimes those kind of new technologies that come in, they'll say, well, and now we want it to, a perfect example is now we need this system to connect with the fire departments. I'm making this up, but if it would be like, we actually want to connect with the fire department's CAD system. And we think we have, you know, in this project funding, we allocated 20,000 for that. And we're like, oh my gosh, you want to do that? Well, that'll take, now I need, let's see, someone who's an expert at this and this, and I got my staff, I could do, you know, we don't know this little part of that. So we need an additional expert for 2 weeks to get this little part filled. And so then that's what these contracts would allow us, is to find the resource. The funding that the departments determine or get for their actual specific project often just are line items associated next to a position or a job, a task on the project, but that staff is not there. And that's what these contracts provide, is the ability to staff those projects. Does that answer that question?
Thank you. I think so. I guess what you're telling me is the expertise for providing the interface between current systems with whatever new system is being implemented or purchased and then implemented is where our IT department kind of comes into play. So is that fair?
Yeah, a little bit, but I think the other part is that well, like I said, when the project is created and the funding is identified, it's just always not clear who the resources to do that work. They depend, even the department's very dependent on our AnITA contracts to fill their need. So yeah, it would be like we don't have that person, that expertise, or we don't have that operational support, and we're going to need a short-term resource to fill it. Gail, do you have anything you want to, can you add to that maybe could help explain it?
I was trying to think about a good example of that. Maybe like the CAMA project that's currently going on to replace the CAMA system, the property appraisal system. We sat down with the department and created a budget, not knowing if IT could resource it because we weren't sure when it was going to start. And so when we priced it out at AnITA contract rates. We ended up being able to staff most of that, but we did end up getting a project manager. So when we're helping budget, if IT can do the work, we do it, but we try to plan for the worst, contracting out as well. So hopefully that helps explain how we use the contracts.
Thanks, Gail.
Thank you. Thank you both. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have one more question, but I will wait to see if there's anybody else that wants to chime in on anything. Thanks.
Great. Thank you. Mr. Constant?
Thanks. So I actually have full faith in this process. It works. It's worked for a long time. But I did receive some questions on a completely different topic related to this particular contract. And it's the question of the local purchase versus the purchase via a third party outside. And I recognize, I think, through the presentation why that is, but I would love to hear it in the words of the administration.
So this is Susie, just to clarify, through the chair, you just want to know, like, why would we use like a vendor that lives in California versus someone who lives in Alaska?
Right. How did that come about and why?
Well, I will say that we did not, in the RFP process, we did not specify that the vendor had to or the company did not have to be based in Alaska. And Ron, can you explain our RFP process in that a little bit?
Thank you, Susie. Through the chair, Mr. Constant, this was, as Susie has talked about, a request for proposal process where we selected the best qualified contractors without regard to location. And and to me, that's the true part of an RFP is you want the best qualified firms. And if they are located in Alaska, that's great. If they're not located in Alaska, that's also great. We pick the best qualified firms and negotiate with them. And that's what the evaluation team did.
Right. And can I ask a little more clarifying, Mr. Chair?
Go ahead.
What became really clear to me was the list of contracts and the schedule of services were very broad. Right. And so to find companies that have that kind of capacity, doesn't that necessitate something broad, like a more searching review? Or, I mean, how many contractors did even bid who are local, et cetera? And so with that, and I see Dean wants to make a comment on the residency question. I believe I understand where he's at too. So I want to get that clearly on the record.
Yeah, you want to say something, Gail? Go ahead.
I would say that I actually think, and I don't know the number, but the majority of the vendors we awarded were local vendors. Mm-hmm. And per the RFP, we only required them to bid at least one schedule of the 34 to be considered for a contract. So and we have a variety of how many schedules a vendor provides. From some of them were very specialized, such as some of the new things we needed were audio video, which IT doesn't really have those skills, but we have a high demand for helping people with conference rooms, etc., and like the assembly chambers. So we know we need expertise in that area, and we do need it local. So we awarded some contracts that only had a few schedules.
And I will just add just one part to that is that every time we have a need, the vendors do supply us with resumes and the location and if they can work remote, do we require somebody on site? And I mean, so we do go through an extra process every time we look at a new scope of work.
And then could we hear from Dean, Mr. Chair?
Sure, hold on. So Ms. Allard, is your comment or question on this topic?
I do. Thank you, Chair. So I would also like to go on the record and state that I think we should have gone through our own contractors or somebody from Alaska to do this. And we're in a real pickle here in our state. And to contract something out of state, I think is something we shouldn't have done. We should have contracted in state and kept it in state to help our economy grow. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Gates?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to comment on this issue about wanting local hire in Alaska vendors. And while, of course, I understand the strong desire to do that and support Alaskans, there's likely some federal constitutional issues with making a residency requirement when you're issuing government contracts. So I think that's probably why, like Mr. Haddon said, it isn't done. So just wanted to point that out. There's a legal issue there.
And Mr. Chair, that was the answer to the question.
I don't want to get into it now.
That was definitely the answer to the question I was seeking.
Thank you. Ms. Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is a little bit in the same vein, but I guess I just kind of want some clarity too on the fact that this ordinance that we're looking at isn't really a mechanism for actually awarding a contract yet. But in this idea of whether vendors are out of state or even out of the country, my understanding is we have some significant issues that we have to be careful with in terms of where vendors are located, because my understanding is that that is what protects us from a security standpoint, is that in order to actually have any kind of redress in a court of law, we have to be making sure that these companies are U.S. based companies. Is that true? And I guess, I just want to make sure that at this point, we're really not awarding any contracts. We are dealing with vendors that we think are providing all of their services in the US. And at what point do we actually kind of make sure we dot that I and cross that T when we're looking at these contracts so that we can make sure we're protecting ourselves in a US court of law should there be any security breach? Thanks.
Susie, would you like me to take that one?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Through the chair, Ms. Kennedy, through this assembly memorandum, you will be approving the award of these 17 contracts to these vendors. And as far as where the work is performed, that is what the IT team evaluates when they get the responses back from the various scopes of work that they issue. They will be evaluating the vendors' method of performance, where they are performing in accordance with the scope of work that they send the vendors. Susie, did you want to add anything, or Gail?
I would like to add that all of these companies are US based. Some do have offshore capability. Historically, we've not used offshore capability, and there's only certain instances where we could or would use offshore. Any contracts that IT agrees to get reviewed by legal and purchasing, and part of those, typically we change the state where to Alaska law for almost every contract. Every now and then, companies do not give into that, but the majority do.
And I'd just like to add just a little bit. Mark, do you just want to, Mark Merchant, talk about our security thresholds and kind of our approach to security?
Sure. Yeah, this is Mark Merchant through the chair, and thanks for the question, Ms. Kennedy. We currently make sure that all folks that are coming are contractors that have elevated privileges, and this is one of the questions that was asked that we sent the answers to Ms. Kennedy. But we definitely verify anyone that gets elevated privileges into the municipality. Whether they're an employee of the municipality or a contractor, has to have an FBI fingerprint background check. So we do not allow anyone to have an unescorted access into the municipality that does not have one of those. So with that being said, whether they're within the United States or SAP, they have folks that are overseas, right? So those folks are required to kind of be escorted or shoulder surf the MOA employee that is the admin for MOA IT to help with that application. And with that, that control and a multitude of other controls that I could go on for the next couple hours about that we help protect the sensitive information. But as far as sensitive information goes and the federally regulated information, like PHI, public health information that is HIPAA, is controlled under HIPAA, and then also with our APD and AFD folks, they deal a lot with criminal justice, or not AFD, criminal justice information. I was prosecutor's office, and so that is CJIS compliant, and so those with CJIS, those have to be within the United States. They have to, if we're not storing that data within the municipality on-prem, then that data has to be stored in a FedRAMP compliant housing, which has to be within the United States and has to fall within their standards. So, but I can go into more detail if anybody has any other questions on that.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you. Mr. Weddleton?
Oh, thanks. I was curious, when you did these RFPs, we have at least in some uses a local hire preference, or there's a discount or something they can bid 5% or something more and be okay with that. Was that applied for these?
Ron, can you answer that?
I do not believe the local hire preference was included in the RFP evaluation process, Mr. Weddleton.
All right, thanks.
Can I speak to that?
Yes.
Thank you. So cost was not a part of the evaluation, but it was a part of the negotiation.
Thank you. Ms. Kennedy?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess off on another line of thinking, though, Mr. Haddon said something that also gives me pause now in a new question. And, you know, my understanding is that this particular resolution or ordinance basically allows the IT department to enter into contracts. What Mr. Haddon said is that these are actual contracts. So I need some clarification on that distinction, and especially because the other part to this was one of the comments was made that these were all of these vendors or the contracts to these vendors were given $1 million blanket amount, whether they needed that much or not. So that gives me great pause to think that we are basically approving $1 million contract for a vendor who maybe we only need $100,000 worth of services from. So I need some real clarification as to what this ordinance does in terms of signing off and approving the $1 million contracts per vendor. Thanks.
Okay, I'm gonna start on that, Ron, and then I'll hand it to you. But one, this isn't this isn't an ordinance; it's a AM, just to clarify. These are non-encumbering contracts. So, Ron, you want to explain more?
These are, as Susie said, these are non-encumbering contracts, and what they do is they authorize a maximum not to exceed amount of $3 million for the initial term. And again, there is no guarantee to any of these contractors that any amount of money will be spent on the contract. What happens is once these contracts are awarded, they establish the terms and conditions and the pricing on which vendors will propose a scope of work that the IT department provides to them, i.e., for example, the IT department will go out and say to these vendors, we want you to propose a project manager to manage the CAD RMS project, for example. These vendors would then come back with a proposal that tells IT how they're going to manage that project, and here's the price that we will charge you for managing that project. If IT then agrees to that, a purchase order would then be issued to that vendor that funds that particular requirement and authorizes the contractor to perform work for a particular dollar amount. And does that help any on providing some clarity to this? Gail, did you want to provide anything else? I saw you blinking.
No, thank you.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that, and I understand that concept. And I guess what I'm having trouble with is the way we use the term contract. And you know, I think there's authorization in there that maybe would have been a better term. But anyway, I guess my other question would be, do you have the information? You had mentioned that some of these vendors you realized you wouldn't need to be going anywhere near the $1 million. Do you have the data on that says which of these 17 people you thought really needed to go to the $1 million level, and some and what the lesser amounts were for any of the other ones that had lesser amounts? Is that information available? Thanks.
I do not have that available. Is that what do you want? What are you asking for?
Thank you. I'm looking at whether or not we can tighten some of these contract amounts up a little bit, specifically or particularly because of the comment that said we know we won't need anywhere near $1 million for this particular vendor. So and you made the statement that you just decided to use this blanket $1 million amount. So I have trouble with that kind of thought, and I would like to see what the individual vendors that have been selected, what the thought was about what the amounts would actually need to be for those individual vendors. And maybe we, again, could tighten up this particular ordinance. Or yeah, thank you.
Can I speak to that, Susie? Just this is Gail. It's a bit difficult because what we're doing is we're putting these contracts into place to support upcoming initiatives that we don't really have fully fleshed out, because a lot of this comes from our customers, such as APD or other IT groups, fire, APD. And then what we do is we help them use these contracts to meet the needs. So we're facilitating projects, basically. We don't know which vendors are going to win those projects. So if we limit one vendor over another, we're essentially could be cutting them out of being able to compete on some of these larger initiatives. So that was one of the reasons that we left everything equal, because it leaves the playing field equal. And although I think we know we probably wouldn't use the full $3 million for every contract every year, we don't know which contracts we might use more of or the other, because it is a competitive process for each scope of work. Thank you.
Thank you, Gail and Susie. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mrs. Slipka, did you want to add anything?
I did want to make a comment, if it's not really clear, is that departments can only spend within their budget. So it's not like this is going to all of a sudden create $50 million worth of extra budget. It's just how the municipality can efficiently and in a timely manner support the budget that the assembly has already approved. So trying to say, I want to constrain this is saying I want to constrain the ability of the administration to act in a flexible and efficient manner in supporting the police, the fire, parks, roads, everything. This does not change anything in relation to the approved budgets. Thanks.
Thank you. Not seeing any further discussion, I'll open it up one last time. All right, not seeing anything, then I'm going to go ahead and end this session. Thanks so much, Susie, and everyone else. So for those of you on the assembly participating in our polar activities, I'll see you at 1:45 at the LUSAC parking lot. Otherwise, we'll see you at 2:45 for the special assembly meeting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.